Welcome everyone. I think we're about ready to get started. Should we kick it off? Awesome. So yeah, again, good morning or afternoon, evening, wherever you're calling in from. Thank you for being here, everyone. I hope you've been enjoying the summit so far. My name is Allison Cooper. I am a product designer with the Course Hero team. And I'm very excited now to welcome you to the session, How to Measure Student Learning in Real World Contexts, Authentic Assessments, okay, which will be led by Dr. Michael Strasser. We hope this session will inspire folks to share ideas with one another. So throughout the session, we welcome your questions, comments, feedback in the chat. In order to respect people's privacy, heads up that we won't be saving the chat for this session, but you are welcome to save it yourself using the 3 dots down below the chat box in the Zoom window there. So again, welcome. Dr. Michael Strasser is an assistant professor of communication in the Nicholson School of Communication and Media at the University of Central Florida, where he also serves as the program coordinator for the Human Communication and Communication and Conflict programs. Dr. Strasser's research is primarily focused on matters relating to instructional communication and communication education. So really lucky to have him with us here today. Thank you so much, Dr. Strasser, for being here. And with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Hey, thanks so much, Allison. So let me go ahead and share my screen and we can go ahead and get started. So first of all, thank you for joining. I know that you all have a lot of other stuff going on. We have an international audience with people from all over. It's just so exciting to be able to potentially hear different ideas and some different things that you all are wondering or doing with your students or just in all those different education capacities that you're in. So I do just want to thank you. And I know that you have valuable time, so we will try to make today as beneficial, applicable, and relevant as possible. So as Allison mentioned, just a really quick, maybe a couple other things in terms of bio. So I am a professor of communication at the University of Central Florida. So that's kind of what I do on a regular basis. But my degree is in something called instructional communication. And so that really is a blend of kind of the communication and education world. So really, how do those two combine? How does communication manifest itself in educational context? That's what I kind of focus on a lot. One other really quick plug. So I'm also the managing editor for Journal of Faculty Development. If you do have different ideas, I know that we probably have a lot of you who are researchers who are doing different things, really cool things in your classrooms. If you're looking for a peer-reviewed place to submit those, we would love to see them in Journal of Faculty Development. So we're talking today about authentic assessments. So how to measure student learning in real world context. And if you are like me, I don't know how many of you are, but I am an assessment nerd. I really like it. I always have for some reason. I think it's usually, you know, when I do training or consulting and I talk about leadership or I talk about vision casting and I talk about goal setting, I always talk about metrics because I love to see impact. I love to be able to communicate impact. And I love to figure out whether or not we are actually doing what we said we were going to do. And when it comes to student learning, I think assessment really allows us to kind of make sure that we are accomplishing all of those goals that we set out to do. So we're going to talk today about something called authentic assessment using authentic assignments. So bear with me on that as we kind of go forward, but that was just a really quick little plug. So just in terms of some additional things, I mentioned that I kind of write at the intersection of communication and education. I also have 5 children. My oldest is 8. So I feel like I don't sleep a lot. Maybe you're like me and are tired and busy. I feel like, Allison, I just need to change that bio that you read to Michael Strasser, tired and busy. And I think it would have been just as accurate. All right, so let's kind of dig in, my friends. In terms of how I facilitate and kind of what I do, let me just kind of give you a little bit of really quick on my style. So if you have questions, if you have things that you're thinking about and they pertain, by all means, put those in the chat. I'm going to kind of nudge Allison every once in a while to say, hey, what's going on in the chat? Am I missing something especially relevant? So don't feel like you can't ask questions. We do have limited time though, so I just want to make sure that we're also careful of that. If you want to reach out to me after the session today, I would love to continue the conversation. So if you would like to do that, please feel free. So here's our outcomes. Here's the 2 things. Here's our 2 end goals for today. So understand assessment as a holistic, transformative, and authentic means to enhance student learning, and then hopefully develop strategies for using, incorporating, developing authentic assessments. Those are 2 end goals. So we have kind of 2 things we're working toward. So let's start kind of talking really quickly about student learning. And I know for many of you, this is going to be old hat type stuff. I feel like I'm kind of preaching to the choir when we talk about this. But I'm curious, and Allison, this is going to be the first time I'm going to put you on the spot to kind of read some of these chat responses. So I want you to actually answer this question in the chat if you have some different things that you're thinking. So how do you know learning has actually taken place? The way I say it is, how do I know my students have actually learned anything? What do you think? Give you a few seconds to start popping those in the chat there. I just noticed somebody said, yay nerds, which is awesome. I feel like I need that to be my bumper sticker. Just yay nerds, exclamation point. That's perfect. So how do you know learning has taken place?
A lot of good stuff coming in through here.
All right, give me a few of them.
Spark, the aha moment, interested in that. And I hear kids explaining the concept to each other, or the idea that they can teach it as a way.
That's
Work
great.
product, practice, demonstrating the behaviors.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's great, Allison. My guess is I'm seeing a bunch more come in too. So if there's any others that you kind of feel like, I got to tell Michael this, then by all means, feel free. So there's a lot of different ways, to be honest with you, that we can tell whether or not learning has actually taken place. So in most of our contexts, though, we probably focus either on knowledge, affect, or behavior, right? We're going to talk about those in just a second. But let me read this quote to you from Ken Bain, because I think this is going to hopefully set a context, a foundation for us in terms of thinking about authentic learning that's measured by authentic assessments. So any learner must remain highly motivated. So my guess is some of you probably are indicating that in the chat, to stick with the arduous process of building a new paradigm and thinking about its implications and applications. To maintain such dedication, students must believe, I think this is key, that their learning will make a difference to themselves and others. To learn deeply, we must intend to do so. I think this is brilliant for what we're going to talk about today. I do a lot of generational research also, so looking at generational differences. And one of the things probably that you already know about Generation Z, especially, is that they are an impact-driven generation. So they want to know that something has made a difference, right? My guess is we're going to continue to see different iterations of that through all of these generations. But I think for our students must believe that their learning will make a difference to themselves and others. So my students are probably not going to be motivated if they don't necessarily see a big picture and end goal of what they're doing, right? I also think that last sentence, to learn deeply, we must intend to do so, is also really key. So I mentioned, how do we know that learning has actually taken place? So the reality is, and this is why assessment is so important. So for all of my other yay nerds out there, when we think about assessment, the reality is I do not necessarily know learning has taken place unless I have kind of the metrics to back that up, right? So that's also part of the reason why outcomes and learning objectives are so important too. As we think about our courses, the reality is that even as, and I've become more of an instructor as facilitator or guide, right? So it used to be sage on the stage. Now we say guide on the side. In some ways, that's still correct. But the reality is that the instructor is still, in many instances, in most cases, creating objectives and outcomes that give us an end goal, something to work towards. And our outcomes and objectives will help us measure whether or not student learning has taken place. So authentic assignments that are actually authentic, and we're going to talk about what that means, measure outcomes that are worthwhile, meaningful, and significant. So as we think back to that deep learning concept that Bain just talked about, and then also just as we think about probably many of the current students that we have in our courses in both K-12 and higher ed context, I would even argue in some corporate training contexts, we're seeing this more and more now, there has to be some semblance of impact. How do we know that this is making a difference to myself and others? But the reality too is that at its core, as we think about learning, we're trying to figure out, and as we assess learning, we're trying to figure out how our students' knowledge has changed, how their attitude towards content or towards the subject has changed, and then ultimately too, how their behavior has changed, which that's what I'm, based on what Allison was saying, my guess is that's probably what's in the chat a lot. It's kind of those behavior skill-based ideas, right? So authentic assignments, if they are designed well, can not only help us kind of position our students to have impact or to do things that increase impact, but also if they're designed well, can really kind of help us to measure student learning when it comes to knowledge, affect, and behavior. So you don't necessarily need to talk about this in the chat, although if some of you want to volunteer it, I think that's great. My guess is the content, the material, the courses that you teach, you probably focus on all three: fit, know, think, and do in some capacity, right? But there are probably some that kind of lend themselves to maybe a little bit more of an increased focus than others. I think a lot of times with authentic assignments, I think that probably we see do, so the behavior change, emphasized more than the other two, which is totally fine. It doesn't mean that the other two are ignored. It doesn't mean that authentic assignments cannot help us, look at what students have actually gained in terms of cognitive knowledge, right? Or whether or not they find something to be more valuable. But my guess is, for many of us, as we start to incorporate just true authentic assignments in our courses, then we probably will focus more on those behaviors. So I just would encourage you, you don't necessarily have to pop this into the chat, but start doing some reflection. Like, as you think about your students, as you think about the courses that you teach, in whatever context that is, no matter the grade level, what's your goal? Like, what are you trying to get the students to do? Increase their knowledge, increase, how they think about something in terms of its value, or are you trying to get them to have different behaviors? You can assess all of those, and it might be that they are all equally weighted, but I think it's worth kind of the reflection to go, am I still on the same page with myself and with my students in terms of what I'm trying to accomplish through this course? So let's talk, we're going to talk about assessment. I'm going to try not to make this too long, but I want to kind of focus on how authentic assessment fits into the big picture before we move on to authentic assignments. So I'm going to try to make a differentiation there as we kind of continue the conversation. So the beauty of assessment is I kind of liken it to a little bit of a cocktail, right? So to get assessment that is meaningful, that actually tells us whether or not learning has occurred, a lot of different things have to go into that, right? So we have our course outcomes that have to go into that. We have our learning objectives that have to go into that. We have our summative, informative, indirect, direct evaluation, all of these different things that go into that. But it's not as if any of these are siloed. So the end goal, hopefully, of assessment is to tell us whether or not students have learned. To get to that end goal, there's a lot of purpose and strategy and intention that goes into kind of figuring out and trying to plan how we are actually determining what we want our students to learn and whether or not they've actually learned it. So I see authentic assessment as part of this bigger picture for assessment in general, right? So we want assessment to be holistic. So what we mean by that is that it's similar to kind of thinking about it in terms of the whole person. But I would also say that we want assessment to be holistic in terms of thinking about all of these different concepts and categories that we're talking about. Doesn't mean that it's going to be like that for every single thing that we do, right? Like, there might be very specific elements that have a very specific categorization for assessment. So standardized tests are a really good example of that. They're still assessment, but they are very literally assessing cognitive knowledge, almost solely cognitive knowledge. So part of what we have to do as we step back is kind of think about, the reality is our students are not one component, right? Like, our students are not just emotional beings. They are not just logical beings. They are humans, and therefore they are holistic themselves. So can we design assessment that is holistic, right? We also want to have assessment that hopefully sees something come to fruition. I always tell faculty members, we want assessment that closes a loop. So here's what I mean by transformative assessment. We want assessment that impacts decision-making down the road. So as I'm designing assignments in my courses, and as I'm trying to figure out whether or not a student has learned anything in my classes, as I'm closing that loop of assessment, I want to then be able to make changes to my teaching, to my course, pertaining to that assessment and whether or not I've determined whether or not students have actually learned anything. But then we also want assessment to be authentic. We want it to be real, and we want it to be, I think, at least I'm going to argue today, kind of discuss today, that we want it to be connected to kind of real life contexts and real life scenarios. So assessment is not clean. It's not pretty. I would argue that it's actually pretty messy. And you just have to kind of buckle down and figure out, what's the end goal? What do I want my students to know, think, or do? Allison, really quick, I don't know if we have any questions in the chat. By all means, you are free to pop those in as we go. But this is probably this is a good transition point if we do have anyone who had a really good comment or any questions so far.
Yeah, it sounds like it's resonating. Feel free to keep adding any questions you've got in the chat at everyone, though. Thanks.
Awesome. All right, so let's kind of transition now to, if we want our excuse me, assessment to be authentic, then we also want our assignments themselves to be authentic. And this is the moneymaker in terms of the actual portion of this particular presentation. So here's what I think is a really good definition of authentic assignments. I'm going to kind of give you some other things to think about in terms of authentic assignments and exactly what I mean by those as we go on. So authentic assignments require application of what students have learned to a new situation and demands judgment to determine what information and skills are relevant and how they should be used. So it very literally is behavior, right? So how do we take what we have learned and apply it to different or new situations? And then I think this second part is really key, demands judgment to determine what information and skills are relevant and how they should be used. So as you think about it, there's a lot of student agency there too. So we're not only preparing them with the skills they need, but we're also preparing them with kind of the critical thinking skills to be able to go, in light of this situation, I can be adaptable and I can apply this that I've learned from my different courses. So there's a lot of stuff going on with authentic assignments if we allow them to kind of penetrate our courses, because it really does present a lot of opportunities for students to really apply what they're learning in those spaces. So authentic assignments have several different goals. So higher order thinking, as you can imagine, especially based on that definition, is by all means a goal. Like higher order thinking, be able to be flexible and adaptable, and not only think through which skills to apply, but actually to be able to apply them correctly and effectively and be able to make something work, right, according to what the course is taught. Authentic assignments answer essential disciplinary questions using real life concepts. So as you can imagine, I'm a communication faculty member. So yes, I teach a lot of public speaking, but I also teach something called crisis communication. So how do organizations handle crisis and risks associated with crises? As you can imagine, had a lot of fun with that during the pandemic, as there were a lot of different crises that we could kind of help organizations with. But the reality is that from a disciplinary perspective, as we think about communication, that lends itself to applying these different skills through these different disciplinary questions that we have in real life context. My guess, though, is that many of you are also part of disciplines where authentic assignments can be applied. And I would argue you can apply them in almost any discipline. So with authentic assignments, we also want to replicate real world performances, which is key. So again, there's a skill-based element here, but we want our students to feel as though they are as close, as akin to a real life situation or scenario as possible. So we want it to be actually realistic. And then finally, we want to involve performance measures and develop applicable skills. So there's metrics associated with what we're doing, as well as making sure that we have this end goal and we are teaching our students how to function and be adaptable and flexible. I want to make one really quick note, because I feel like a lot of times when I talk about authentic assignments, people say, well, this sounds similar to service learning. I would argue that I think that the umbrella is kind of authentic assignments, and service learning is one way to do that, right? So where we could have our course paired up with a client and you actually do different things that allow them to experience some real life skills, real life scenarios, while serving this particular entity, whatever that is an authentic means of assessing student learning. So I think that that's one way to get there, right? It's through different service learning mechanisms. But I just want to share that because I do think that there's a reality where the authentic element here is the umbrella. And then we have all of these different kind of tentacles, different kind of things that are under that allow for us to move to this authentic element. So real world, not kind of fake element, right? So authentic assignments are scaffolded typically, and students can practice skills and are provided consistent and helpful feedback. Now, this is where it becomes crucial for an instructor, not just to know the end goal, but to also have really developed steps, strategies, procedures all along the process for students to be able to learn skills and apply skills. And the instructor cannot just disappear. Like, you have to be consistently present, offering feedback, offering consistent ideas, offering very tailored, individualized, unique feedback to each of your students. But it doesn't just happen overnight, right? Like, there is a very specific process, almost like, while I would say that in some ways it's definitely not competency based, there is a level where with some of this, you have to learn certain competencies as you move forward to be able to do what you need to do. So I just want to make sure to mention that as well. This is way too much text, but I know that Allison is going to send out the link to the slide so you can kind of go through this particular table and kind of see some differences here. But this table, I think, does a really good job of saying, look, here's what we have. We have typical tests. So think of this like your, typical midterm, typical exam. And we kind of have this exam, this typical element that is kind of compared to authentic tasks. So these would be considered authentic, right? In my opinion, I wouldn't necessarily see a 50 question multiple choice exam as authentic. It doesn't mean it's bad. Again, I think going back to what do you want your students to know, think, or do? If you are teaching a course or a grade level where you are focusing primarily on knowledge, and to do that or to measure that, you have mostly tests, I think that's okay. As long as they're designed well and you do all those different types of things. But the reality is that those exams, those midterms, those finals that we give, those standard tests that we give are not necessarily authentic, right? So there's a comparison here between the typical, the authentic tasks, and then even there's that column that says indicators of authenticity, which I think is really good. So I would encourage you, you don't have to do it right now. I think especially for time, we don't really have time to go through all of these, but there is a comparative element here as we look at what would be considered those typical tests, assessments that we give compared to things that would be more authentic tasks that a student can complete. So I love this quote. So assignments are authentic when there is a meaningful connection between the grade and project participation. Meaningful connection being the two kind of key words there. So we don't want to forget about those. But there's a level where, again, so we think back to that Bain quote at the very beginning, there is measurable impact on either the students themselves or others. A meaningful connection between the grade and project participation, meaning it's not just about the grade. It's about something else as well, right? It's not solely about what the student receives on their report card, but it's also about meaningful connection through the participation of the project that lends itself to applied relevant skill sets. So as we think about authentic assessment and kind of how students function in the midst of these, there are kind of some different things that students must do, right, to actually make assignments authentic, or at least students must accomplish, right? I think the instructor must set it up so that these can be accomplished. Students must apply course concepts to real world scenarios by completing meaningful assessments, meaning meaningful projects, right? Meaningful things that tie back into what you have kind of determined at the beginning as you think about what students need to know, think, or do. So there's a level where I think, in terms of thinking big picture, like it's definitely not just busy work. It's definitely not just a test for the sake of a test, but there is heavy emphasis on application to real world scenarios through these meaningful assessments. So not just assessments or assignments that are kind of thrown out, thrown away, but the evaluation actually means something. It's tangible. We see it. It has impact. There's something there that allows us to see that it's either impacting ourselves or others. And I think that's important. I'm gonna go ahead and pause here for just a second. I'm seeing some other comments in the chat. Allison, I don't know if we have any other really good thoughts or any other questions, different things, even if there's some suggestions or different ways that people kind of implement this.
Yeah, there's some great discussion going in there. One theme is just sort of, how to balance this. We're all tired, overworked, right? How to think about, where do you find the time to redesign and make these assessments authentic?
Okay, that's awesome. So let's talk about this. So remember, like you can very literally, I'm going to give Allison a revised bio that says Michael Stralzer, busy and tired, busy and tired. Here's what I would say. So this doesn't have to be crazy in terms of the amount of time, right? It doesn't have to be something where you are either completely redesigning a course to kind of be quote unquote authentic, but I do think you can start to kind of develop assignments that are more authentic. Now, very practically, like if you're looking for, I always use the phrase low hanging fruit. So if you're looking for low hanging fruit, meaning something you can implement right away, I wouldn't necessarily say that a case study is a real world scenario. Although I think if you're looking for ways to try to help students to think a little bit more about how would you implement this in a situation that has happened, and you're going, I don't know, like there are other things that I feel like I can't do. I've got too much stuff going on. That is a very low hanging fruit that says, I want you to take the skills that you've learned and try to apply these. I will also tell you, if you really, want to dive into this, there is no shortage of nonprofits, especially, who would love free help. Whether that's, through marketing campaigns, or, training, or, even helping them think through strategies to reach younger generations for donor or volunteer purposes. Like I can guarantee you, if you actually stop and think about it, you can find a quote unquote client who would be more than happy to kind of be the test vehicle for your class to implement some of their skills in real world scenarios. It could even be like, even think about, if you're in a math course, you might be able to contact some different entities who have access to big data, and maybe you can have your students, analyze that data for them. That's great. Like that's applying course concepts, real world skills to real world scenarios. That's authentic. That's good. So I do just think that, I think with teaching, we always need to remember that it's probably not wise. And I'll actually even speak bigger picture. Like, you're going to walk away from this education summit and you're going to have a million ideas. And I think for me, every time I go to a conference, I feel weighed down by these million ideas. What I want you to do is be liberated by them. To go, you know what? The next time that I teach, I want to do 3 things, 1, 2, 3, and just really kind of incrementally try to make some changes. And I think if you can do that consistently throughout your, professional career, 10, 15, 20 years down the road, if you've done that, you're, the sky's the limit in terms of different things that you've done. But I don't think it has to be that you completely re-tailor a class for this. I do very literally, like, part of why I think we talk about authentic assignments is that an assignment itself can be authentic without the entire course lending itself to this massive client-driven real world scenario. Like, you can think about individual assignments and go, okay, instead of having them write a paper, how can I have them engage in a project that would be considered more of an authentic assignment, where they can apply their skills? I think that's the biggest thing, Allison, as you're kind of reading that chat still. Are you giving them an opportunity to apply what they are learning in a meaningful way to real world scenarios? That's what we're talking about when we talk about authentic. So, I teach at the University of Central Florida, where some of my colleagues have classes with 1,200 students. Like, y'all, it's going to be tough to do authentic assignments in a course with 1,200 students. You can do it, and I've got some colleagues who can do it, but it's tough to do that. So what's your context? How much can you do in terms of kind of being able to think big picture, and then not necessarily feeling like you have to do all of these things right? So Allison, I saw you on mute. I don't know if you have some other things.
Kind of connects. There's some discussion too of how this can apply to any course, any content area. So specific questions, can it apply to humanities, philosophy, or intro courses? If you can speak to that.
Yeah, let's I think I'm going to, so I don't want to steal my own thunder, but I think I'm going to show just kind of a little bit of a pathway for authentic assignments that I think will kind of indicate how it can connect to different disciplines. But that's awesome. I get it. So let's kind of keep going here. So here's another just comparative element in terms of thinking about authentic assignments. So the benefits does increase motivation, like you can imagine why, because it's meaningful, impact driven, does help students build their communication skills because they actually have to, engage with others and not just be able to hide or do something that's individual. It can aid in that holistic assessment. So thinking about our students as holistic beings and thinking about kind of measuring all of these different types of things. Higher order creative thinking as well as problem solving. Challenges, you've already indicated this in the chat. It is time consuming for both the student and the teacher, which is why, while I think it can be applied in any class or discipline, I don't necessarily think that it has to, in terms of like, that you got to go back and go, oh, I'm not giving my students an opportunity to apply what they're learning. I got to completely revamp everything. It's a ton of time. So I think you have to kind of decide what, very practically, am I going to be able to do this well and not just do it? And because there is a lot of time, especially from the instructor, in terms of feedback. Hard to navigate details, excuse me, and align real world clients and participation. Totally. And then students may rebel because it's different. Although I think that if it's done well, you will not have a lot of rebellion. you might just have kind of minor rebellion, or at least students kind of maybe being frustrated with the time, but not necessarily thinking that it's not something worth doing. So I think there is a difference with that. So as we think about traditional assessment versus authentic assessment, right? So traditional assessment says you need to select a response. Authentic assessment says you need to perform a task. Traditional is more contrived. Authentic is more about real life. Recall, recognition versus construction and application. I would say that traditional assessment tends to be more teacher structured, whereas authentic tends to be more student structured because your students do have more agency. However, I think that saying this, like authentic assignment or authentic assessment, still is heavy teacher involvement, right? Like heavy instructor involvement. You can't just disappear. Traditional assessment tends to be a little bit more indirect evidence of student learning, whereas authentic assessment tends to be a little bit more direct, which I think is also helpful depending on the course and depending on the objectives and the outcomes that you've kind of developed. So here are some different ideas, right? So this is, and I would actually love, I think what would be really helpful in the chat, if you have some creative ideas that you're thinking of, oh, I would love to do this in my own course. I'll give you something that I'm going to try in one of my graduate classes in the fall. I teach a course called Teaching Communication. So all of our GTAs who teach for the Nicholson School have to take my class before they are allowed to teach undergraduate communication classes. And we are, for the first time, partnering with a nonprofit where we are actually going to design and develop, it's going to end up being a half day of like targeted communication training. And so the course content kind of focuses broadly on teaching communication as a whole. We talk about teaching, university students, but my argument is a lot of the skills that we use with teaching university students are pretty similar to just corporate training in general. And so we're going to be basically developing and facilitating a communication training for nonprofit leaders in Orlando, which is really cool. So that's very direct application to a real world scenario. In that assignment replaces something that they were already doing in the course. So like I took something away, added something. The entire class is not structured to work around that. It's just their final project is structured to be something that was replaced with this instead of something else that they were doing. So I think that's probably maybe a good balance. But yeah, case studies I think can be a really low hanging fruit for this. Real life strategic plan for real life clients, deliverable to solve a real world problem. This is another thing. I think you don't even necessarily have to have them directly work with a client, although I think you can and should if the opportunity presents itself. But they're like, they may be watching in real time a real world problem happen that they can work towards solving in the course. And they don't necessarily even have to take that deliverable to the client, although I think it would be really cool if they did eventually. But you can kind of have them watch and observe and go, wow, this is happening. We believe we have the skills to solve this. How would you do that? And then you kind of give them an opportunity to do that. Analyze the impact of new public policy from the perspective of various stakeholders, diagram a process using if-then ideas, role play, analyze if-then scenarios. Like that's another low-hanging fruit one that I think still does what we're trying to do, which is apply skills in real-world scenarios. So that's it, right? So I think if you're worried about time, I get it, totally understand. I think there are incremental things that we can do that don't necessarily feel so overwhelming that you can kind of do a little bit at a time to kind of emphasize this. So this is, I know we've got probably, I think we've got around 12 minutes, so a little over 10 minutes left to go. So this is, I've given you a little bit of a process for kind of thinking through, no matter your discipline, no matter the course that you teach, that I think will help you consider how you can apply authentic assignments in your courses. So I haven't done the work for you in terms of like giving you some very specific things to do, but I at least wanted to give you some questions to ask yourself to kind of say, okay, if I was going to develop, an authentic assignment in my course, how would I go about doing that? So if you start in that, upper left quadrant, what is your discipline? So identify major issues, problems surrounding this topic area. Communication, there's always a communication issue. I tell people all the time, every problem is a communication problem in some capacity, right? So for me, I would start and I would say, okay, as I look at communication, what are the different discipline specific issues that we have? So as the broader discipline, what are we dealing with? And then what course are you teaching? And identify major issues, problems surrounding this particular topic area. So even going back to the example that I gave of how I'm implementing this in my teaching communication class, teaching communication very specifically teaches future teachers how to teach. So that's the problem for the participants. But then we also have like issues, Central Florida has an insane number of nonprofits, many of which have limited resources, limited people to be able to solve problems. So can we offer some targeted training that might help facilitate problem solving and give some new skills? Like I think especially a lot of nonprofits struggle with social media. So that will, I'm sure, be part of our half-day training. So there's an issue that I need to solve with the students, but then there's also an issue that I need to solve kind of broadly in terms of looking at the course content and going, okay, from a real life scenario, how can I kind of change and do some things a little bit differently? And then you kind of step back and go, okay, what are those real world problems that my students need to solve or know how to solve, right? So you're just kind of incrementally asking yourself these questions to say, very practically, how can I make this as specific as possible? Then from a course perspective, so now we transition. So this was kind of the preliminary, what questions am I asking about kind of what's going on? We transition to, as I think about the course, what training information is needed to solve these problems. And this is really where you start talking about what students will actually learn within the class or for purposes of applying skills to the assignment. So as you, like, I'm not just going to release my graduate students into a training situation without training them, to learn how to do that, right? And offering pinpointed feedback on, micro teaching and different things throughout the process. So that's your fourth question. Number 5, how can your students solve these problems? What skills do they need to demonstrate? I think is a really big one. So literally, like, teaching is a skill. So that's the skill that they need to demonstrate to be able to solve these problems, right? And then finally, and this is where you kind of have to step back and go, okay, now if I was to make this an assignment, and this is where I love instructor agency, like the world is your oyster. For many of us, we have a lot of freedom, a lot of autonomy to design assignments and our courses and our syllabi how we want. So this is really where you kind of step back and say, now, what do I need to do to turn this into an assignment? And I think that's really part of how we think about the big picture here. So now that I've got all these questions answered, what does it look like for me to actually make this assignment in my course? Either a low stakes assignment, although my guess is you probably want to be careful with how much time they're going to devote to it if it's a low stakes assignment, or a high stakes assignment that's worth a little bit more in terms of the total percentage of the course. So I'm landing the plane, Allison, so we can kind of get to some more questions here, different comments that people have. So authentic assignments allow students to construct their own learning. I genuinely believe that there is a level where you are giving students agency, which is part of what they crave right now. And I don't necessarily think that's going away, but they become empowered and motivated because they are part of the learning process. They are seeing the skills that they are learning applied in real world scenarios, and it hopefully will motivate them so that they don't step back and go, all I learned in this course is how to take a test or how to memorize. And then number 2, they truly, I believe, allow students to demonstrate their skills. However, as we think back to kind of know, think, do, it's not just the skills. Like, they're also hopefully gaining knowledge and hopefully kind of having some different affect in terms of different things that they're thinking. All right, so the obligatory QR code, if you want to use this to kind of go to a resource. So authentic assessment and authentic assignments, they're not necessarily new. They've been around for a while. And they've been around in a lot of different capacities. They've had some different names, but this is a toolbox by Mueller. I think probably maybe was posted 15, 20 years ago, and it's still relevant, which is crazy. Think about that. How many things are still relevant that were created 15, 20 years ago? But this is a great resource for you if you want to take out your phones and scan that. I think that's kind of a wonderful opportunity for you to kind of have some additional strategies and things to think about. So all of that to say, if we have some questions, I would love to kind of answer some questions if I can, or even if we have some questions, I might, depending on what the question is, even turn it around to the audience to answer some of these through the chat. But I'm going to take a deep breath. And Allison, if you're seeing anything that can kind of get us started with this, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, there's a lot of expertise in here in the chat. There's a really good brainstorm happening around an ancient literature application, and people sharing too what they've done in their courses. I know one question I saw come through earlier too, that I wanted to make sure we addressed is if you could provide more examples of specifically the concept of how this is scaffolding, like how can you scaffold in this context?
Okay, so let me use it maybe from my personal context of the idea. I'll just keep using the teaching calm example. So if I'm teaching students how to teach, we don't just right away talk about creating rubrics, right? Like I'm probably going to, at the beginning, talk about, hey, how do our brains work? Like, how do we actually start to learn different things? And in the midst of that, how do we start to think about course design as a whole, right? How do we then talk about course outcomes or objectives? So there, and then probably would give little mini assignments that kind of connect back to all of those topics, so that it's not scaffolding. Just means that basically we're looking at this skill set and we're saying they're not going to get all of these skills right away. So how do we kind of break them down into manageable chunks so that we're building this skill set and kind of scaffolding, building it, right, very literally, so that by the time they go to apply the skills, they have kind of practiced different things throughout. But I think there's some intentionality there, you know, even going back to even the big data analysis example that I gave. Like, you don't just give students a data set and say, all right, go analyze it, tell me what you see. Like, you have to teach them the software, and you have to teach them the different formulas. Even though they might use the software and it has the formulas embedded, like, they have to know why they're doing the math that they're doing. So it just recognizes that as you think about the skills that are needed, they don't all happen all at once. So what are those different steps that we need to take in order to kind of see these skills actually applied and kind of come to fruition? That's a really good question, though. It's great. Any other questions? Any other thoughts?
Yeah, just so many cool ideas going on in here. A reminder that we're not going to share this chat publicly, but you can save it with those 3 dots over the chat box if you'd like. Any last questions? We've got a few more minutes.
So if there is, Allison, by all means, feel free to kind of nudge me. So just a couple really quick things, and then we'll let you go. It's almost 2:45. So remember, as we're thinking about, like, what are we actually trying to accomplish? It's the application of skills in real world context. And so it doesn't, excuse me, necessarily have to be something that is volcanic, earth shattering. Like, really all we're saying is we have all of these traditional, typical things that we're doing in our courses. If we really are teaching our students to do something, to behave in a certain way, well, then are we giving them opportunities to be able to practice those skills? That's really what's going on here. So even that list, like with all of those different ideas, doesn't necessarily have to mean that right away you need to go out and partner with this massive nonprofit and try to figure out how you and your students can solve all of the problems of the world. Good luck, right? But it does mean, hey, my students are learning something. I want to give them opportunities to actually practice that, so it becomes a little bit more experiential. I do think there's some different elements where they kind of start to teach each other and see these skills kind of manifest in different and unique ways. So I think that's the biggest thing. I want to liberate you to think creatively and not necessarily feel like you have to do a bunch of crazy stuff right away, but legitimately just give your students an opportunity to practice the skills that they're learning in your courses in scenarios that would be considered more real world as opposed to contrived. That's it. So I think if you can do that, even if you can at least think about it, I think that's a victory, right? And kind of think about how to do that. So y'all were awesome. I'm going to go back if I have maybe 20 seconds, or at least I'm probably going to have save the chat myself, just kind of see some of the comments. But if you look at the slide deck, my QR code for my LinkedIn is at the very beginning. By all means, feel free to reach out to me. I would love to continue the conversation, but y'all were great.
Yeah, this was awesome. I really can't thank you enough. Seriously, seemed to really inspire a lot of folks here. I know I'm really excited. This seems like a really cool way to learn too. I'll just share now, just a reminder, of course, thank you again, everyone, for joining. Feel free, of course, to keep joining the summit. We've got a bunch of other great upcoming sessions that are all available on the event agenda page. So let me just drop that link in the chat really quick if you need it. The link to the agenda to access the next session. So thank you so much again, Michael. This was really, really cool. And thank you everyone for joining. I hope you have a great, that ideation around this ancient literature use case was really
Yeah.
fun.
How
Really
far
fun.
up is that? I'm looking for. Is it pretty? I mean,
And
there's a lot of chat.
above all the thank yous, yeah, people were saying like uh, to do like a Hollywood style, build your own universe based on it.
Oh,
People
that's awesome.
talking about teaching it. It was really cool.
Oh,
Uh,
cool. Oh, cool. Okay, that's great.
this was great. Thank you so much. Really, really
Yeah,
inspiring. Yeah,
my pleasure, Allison. Thank you.
I've got a great toolkit around this. So really, really glad to have you. Yeah. So we can close the session now. I know we've got a bunch of attendees. It looked like there were a couple hundred in there. So yeah, really great. Have a great rest of your day again. Thank you.